Greetings, my name is Monty Martin.
And I'm Kelly McLaughlin.
And we are the Dungeon Dudes. Welcome to our channel where today we are branching out from the worlds of Dungeons & Dragons and talking about Call of Cthulhu.
Monty and I love experiencing new tabletop RPGs, and although we rely on D&D and always come back to it, it's a lot of fun to try new games and see what they have to offer. And so today we thought we would share with you our experience playing Call of Cthulhu 7th edition.
We recently picked up the starter set for Call of Cthulhu 7th edition. This is a great introduction to this role-playing game, but there's other publications like the Keeper's Handbook and the Investigator's Handbook, neither of which I think are actually really necessary for getting into COC. This is really all you need to start playing the game. And so today we're going to talk about what's in this box, basic overview of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game system, as well as our impressions on playing the game based on our recent live stream that you can find right up over here.
There's a lot to discuss today, so let's get rolling.
So Call of Cthulhu is an investigative horror-themed tabletop role-playing game. It is inspired by the mythos of H.P. Lovecraft and other writers, and it deals with the world of mysteries, cosmic horror, and investigative fiction.
So the Call of Cthulhu starter set for 7th edition includes everything that you need to get started playing the game. And it's quite a simple and effective starter set. You don't need a lot to play Call of Cthulhu. You need a set of dice, which are included in the box. And then there are 3 books involved.
The first book, Book 1, is actually a really interesting inclusion for a starter set for a role-playing game because it is an adventure, Alone Against the Flames. Uniquely, though, this is a solo adventure that is kind of in the choose-your-own-adventure style format where you're going to flip between pages as you progress through the adventure. I quite enjoyed it, although I will say as a veteran role-playing game player, a choose-your-own-adventure style module, even one where you are rolling dice, is still very different from the actual experience of playing a role-playing game. It was a lot of fun regardless, and it was a fun alternative to an evening spent playing video games.
The one thing that I will say I like about the inclusion of that, though, is that if this is your first dive into tabletop role-playing games and you haven't gathered a group of friends and you're not sure about how to dive in yet, you've just picked up the box set and you want to see what it's all about, it's a great way to just sit at home and try it out by yourself before going and scrounging up your friends and being like, we're going to try Call of Cthulhu. And that invitation to be able to play the game without needing to go out of your way to find a group is really inviting.
Now, the second booklet that is in this box are the introductory rules themselves. And fundamentally, this is very lightweight. It is 23 pages long, and most of it concerns a broad introduction to what a role-playing game even is, descriptions of the different skills in the game, and a walkthrough to build your own character. The actual rules of Call of Cthulhu, beyond character creation, are really about 4 pages, and the combat rules are 2 of them.
The rule book out of the 3 books is by far the shortest of all 3 books presented in this starter set.
Indeed. I did look ahead at the Keeper's Handbook and the Investigator's Handbook that are for COC, and I really felt like this was more digestible and gave me everything that I needed as a veteran role-playing game player to dive into COC. I think that maybe I would rely on the Keeper's Handbook for more adventure design type stuff and scenario design type things, but this gave me everything I needed to actually play the game.
Finally, we have Book 3, which presents 3 different scenarios that you can run. We ourselves tried out Paper Chase with Monty as the keeper, myself, and our friend Jill as the players. But there are 2 other adventures in here as well that we're hoping to try out in the near future.
Yeah, there's Edge of Darkness and Dead Man's Stomp are the other 2 adventures in this. What's notable is that Paper Chase is playable with 1 keeper, the game master, and 1 player, an investigator. So once again, this is a really smart thing with the starter set in that you can dive into the game yourself by playing the solo adventure and then get 1 friend to play it with you. I quite like this, and it's one of those very notable things about Call of Cthulhu in general, in that because it doesn't have the party roles or the combat focus of a game like Dungeons and Dragons, it's very easy to play the game narratively with just one player and one game master. There's that fictive format that is characteristic of so many of the stories that inspired Call of Cthulhu. So 3 adventures right off there in the bat. A lot of gameplay for what you're getting. Paper Chase took a single session to finish. From my understanding, the other 2 adventures are multi-session affairs. So I feel like, all told, you're probably going to pretty reliably get about 8 to 10 game sessions worth of play out of what's in this starter set.
And that's amazing. The last thing that's in the box are pre-generated characters, and they're very simple and straightforward. I actually like there's some cheeky references in here.
There are. I do.
There's the professor who...
There is definitely Indiana Jones, not Nevada Jones, so it's not even being subtle.
It's there.
Yeah, so a couple pre-made characters and then a couple extra blank character sheets as well if you need to roll up your own Call of Cthulhu character. And I do think it's worth noting as well, just with the COC character sheet as we get into talking about the game itself. The front side of this character sheet is all mechanical stuff, and the back side of the COC character sheet is virtually all descriptive in nature. So this is a very, very lightweight character sheet compared to other games that we're used to playing, where it looks like it's a jam-packed sheet, but it's surprising how in play it was everything that you needed.
I will say that when I first looked at the character sheet, I immediately was like, oh, this looks far more complicated than D&D. But then after playing, I felt at ease with everything presented. And that's something that's really beautiful about Call of Cthulhu, is even at its most complex, it actually ends up being very digestible.
Now, also in the box, the other adventures have handouts. So you get all the handouts and the notebook pages, the map of Arkham, and all that fun stuff that you'll need for the other 2 adventures. Paper Chase did not use any of these handouts, but the other 2 do. So that's what's in the starter set box. I think you get a lot of bang for your buck for my money. And I really like the elegant sort of progression from the solo adventure to the 1 player, 1 game master adventure to bringing in more players for the other adventures.
Absolutely. And when we do talk about the system, this is coming from the perspective of 2 people who have been playing D&D for a long time. But jumping into Call of Cthulhu was very exciting. Not only is it a tone and atmosphere that Monty and I are both huge fans of, but Call of Cthulhu really got to double down on the investigative mystery set in a horror-themed world. And that right away is something that very much interested us and allowed us to dive in readily, because even in our D&D games, we definitely try to inject investigation, mystery, and horror into our D&D games as often as we can. So being able to have a system that already presented that was beautiful.
Now, full disclosure, I've had a limited experience with Call of Cthulhu prior to this, having played some games at conventions and in other settings with other role-playing game players, but it's been years since I've sat down and played COC on anything resembling a regular basis. So this was very refreshing for me. I will say as a disclaimer, I felt myself, my collective knowledge from running a lot of other role-playing games, D&D and others, definitely helped me pick this up very, very quickly. So if you're totally new to role-playing games, you probably still got that learning curve. But I will also say that if you have played D&D, you already know how to play COC.
I, as a player in the COC game, having played 1 game, can already grasp, I'm going to say 90% of the mechanics. It was the 10% that was a small learning curve that we were really able to kind of smooth out within an hour or 2.
So let's talk about the mechanics and actually playing the system of Call of Cthulhu itself. As we said before, COC is an investigative horror role-playing game. So the focus of the game is on solving mysteries that often involve the monsters and eldritch terror associated with the Cthulhu mythos. So this isn't just your standard murder mystery type affair. So the two types of things that I think really resonate strongly with Call of Cthulhu today would be things like the X-Files, but also Stranger Things.
We've also both been watching Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities on Netflix, and I swear every episode of that show, I want to take notes down, and it could be a standalone Call of Cthulhu adventure. Brilliant inspiration for Lovecraftian horror.
And so the classic setting for Call of Cthulhu is 1920s New England, reflective of where H.P. Lovecraft and his contemporaries were actually writing their stories. But for us, we transplanted our game into 1991 small town Ontario, and it was basically seamless. I actually think for myself that playing Call of Cthulhu in the modern era or even the present day is one of the big strengths of the system, especially when you set it in the real world, and especially when you set it in your own neighborhood, in your own backyard. I think that that's like the secret sauce.
What was beautiful is because you set it in the modern day and you pick a town that's nearby, it makes the horror that much more real. And I think that's what Call of Cthulhu lends itself to. Whether you're playing the 1920s or modern day, the beauty of the juxtaposition of regular people doing regular people things, and then a mystery happens, and then something horrible and otherworldly happens, feels a lot different than a fantasy game of D&D.
And if you're wondering what the difference between playing in the 1920s versus the modern era actually is, mechanically speaking, it's very small. It just adds a couple different skills and adjusts a few different things. For example, modern people know a lot more about computers than anyone in 1922 did. So like any role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu is played with a game master called the Keeper and the players, which are referred to as the investigators. The game is playable with one or more investigators. My suspicion is I think Call of Cthulhu plays best with 1 to 3. I think that as soon as you got to 4 people, you got too many.
I agree. This game actually felt more so than D&D that it lends itself to a small group. Yeah. We played our live stream with 2, and that felt like a very dynamic duo that could solve a lot of the mysteries, work together. And I actually think, your 1 to 3 is the sweet spot, because you either have the main character, the dynamic duo, or the rule of 3. The rule of 3 is a very famous tradition in a lot of writing, and so either way, you're getting something pivotal. As soon as you move to 4, you now have a party or an entourage or an entire investigative department involved.
Yeah.
And anything higher than 4, I think that you're actually might be taking away from what Call of Cthulhu's offering. But I might be wrong in that. I haven't heard much of people playing large games, but I'd be interested to hear how that went.
Now, the system uses the classic ability scores that you are familiar with. We've got our strength, dexterity, constitution, and intelligence. And in this system, we have willpower, or POW, and appearance, which I think is still basically charisma. We also add the size stat and the education stat. And then from there, there's a couple game statistics for your character, like their magic, sanity, and their speed, which are derived based on these statistics. We'll get into more of those later.
The game also presents a number of skills. For those of you jumping from D&D, you're going to notice there's a lot more skills here. And I do enjoy that the skills actually cover a lot of different bases for what's going to go on in the game. Now, skills are given percentages, and we're going to get into that in a second, but each skill has a percentage associated with it, and depending on how you're building your character, you're going to get a pool of points that you can give to certain skills, and that's going to raise the percentage of those skills. When you need to do a skill check or a skill challenge, you are going to roll a percentile die. That is a D100, or for those of you who have the set of dice, 2D10s that will equal out to a percentage. Depending on how high your skill is, the higher the better, because you want to roll under your percentage in that skill. So if you have a spot hidden skill of 75, you need to roll 75% or lower in order to spot the hidden thing in the room. That's the gist of how skills work in Call of Cthulhu.
What's cool about this is that when you look at your character sheet and you're asked to make a roll, you know exactly what your chances of success or failure actually are. And for many characters, you might not have too many skills that are 75% or higher or 90%. You might have a whole bunch of skills that are maybe only 10%, 15%, 40%. And that's part of the specialness of the system, is that there's such a huge list of skills. It's really hard for your character to be good at everything, and you still do need to be a character. The Keeper has a few levers they can pull to adjust the difficulty, though. The Keeper can ask you to make a difficult check, in which case you have to roll under half of what your normal skill level is, or an extreme check, which is 1/5. There's also a couple mechanics that allow you to roll additional die or push a roll to try again, that give characters and keepers a little bit of flexibility and a little bit more nuance on how to do things like opposed checks or more different situations and circumstances. What's nice about the Call of Cthulhu character sheet, though, is that the boxes on the character sheet give you the space to put in your half and 1/5 numbers for the difficult and extreme checks, and the PDF versions of this character sheet calculate this for you automatically.
Which is beautiful and very helpful, because if you have that all on your sheet, it means that when the Keeper says, I need you to make a difficult check, roll under half, you don't have to do any math. You just look at your character sheet, see the half number, and know what you got to roll. And it can be really intense rolling those dice. I found that knowing what I was going for, a lot of people in D&D sometimes think that that takes away. Knowing the DC or difficulty challenge of a roll can take away from the moment. I actually found in Call of Cthulhu, it added an intensity to each roll I made, because knowing what was about to pop up and whether or not I was going to pass or fail adds some intense emotion to each die roll.
And what's beautiful about this is that if you've played D&D and you know how to make a skill check in D&D, you basically know how to play all of Call of Cthulhu, because that's all there is to the mechanical weight of the system. There's a few other mechanics and subsystems like sanity and a few other additional rules for combat that we'll describe in a moment, but overall, every skill in the game, whether it's computer use, shooting a gun, dodging out of the way, trying to find something that's hidden from you, or knowing, or how much your character knows about languages or anthropology or psychology, is all rolled using this system. And so it means that you have a lot of options, and I really think that it's hard to say what the optimal skills are. And there's not really much optimization that you can do, because the character advancement in Cthulhu is based on, did you use the skill? And then you have a chance of that skill increasing if you used it. There's no character levels to speak of.
And I do really like that about this system. In D&D, we get caught up in optimization and metagaming and all of those aspects of using the rules and seeing how we can build the best character possible. In Call of Cthulhu, really no character is going to be the best character, and they're probably going to die horribly. And I've heard from many people that Call of Cthulhu is a game where the win situation is your character did not die or go insane, and that's very rare. And usually if you live long enough, your character is going to go absolutely insane. So keeping that in mind, you're not here to play the powerful character. As a matter of fact, another point of this system that I would like to talk about is the hit points. This is not a game where combat is one of the pillars of play. In D&D, we talk about combat, exploration, and social encounters. In this, social encounters, exploration, and investigation are really your pillars of play. If you get into a combat situation, you're best to run, avoid it entirely, or try to go back and find a clever way to outdo or manipulate the situation in a way that's going to benefit you, because our characters only had 9 and 10 hit points, I believe.
Yep.
And a gun does 1d10 damage. So there's a good possibility that 1 or 2 shots from a gun is going to kill you. That generally means that, unlike D&D, where I can go running up to a giant troll and start stabbing it with my dagger, you don't want to do that in Call of Cthulhu.
No. And, well, it is possible to have a brawl with another human person, and those kind of events, like human characters do D3 damage when they punch each other. There's ways to get a damage bonus, and there's obviously things like switchblades, baseball bats, knives, and all those things. Not everyone's going to have a handgun. But combat is pretty lethal, And if you're going to go up against the monsters of the Cthulhu mythos, you're probably just going to get devoured. And so the combat element is a small part of the overall picture of the character and the ways that the adventures are written and designed for Call of Cthulhu scenarios. So the other component of that, though, that your character has is their sanity score. The sanity scores for our characters were about 40 to 50 or so.
Yeah.
And you lose sanity points when you are exposed to the awful truths of reality imposed by the Cthulhu mythos. And of course, this can cause bouts of madness and eventually for your character to go completely insane and then become an NPC under the Keeper's control. So there's kind of like 2 health bars that you've got. And you have to worry about both of those ones together.
You know, there was a great video game back in the day that I still think is one of my favorite concepts for a game. It never saw a sequel, called Eternal Darkness.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of that, where Eternal Darkness was one of the first games I played where you had your magic bar, your health bar, and your sanity bar. And having to gauge all of those as your health bar was going down, sometimes your health bar would be full, but if your sanity was dropping, you needed to change the situation or get out of there, because it can get ugly really fast.
Now, of course, this is just a brief overview of the broad mechanics of Call of Cthulhu, not an in-depth guide to how to make a character or every single mechanic that is in play, such as the combat mechanics, how the initiative system works, and how damage and dying work. But to say that all those are present, and they're all pretty lightweight and straightforward. I really found that for myself, as an experienced game master for D&D, I was able to read all these, grok it all, and it was more about unlearning what I had learned, because it really feels like it's just stripped down. Like it's pulled away unessential things, and is just focusing on the few mechanical things you need for an investigative game. And I think one of the things that I brought to it as a game master is having been familiar with other investigative systems like Gumshoe and other Powered by the Apocalypse systems, which have a fail-forward mechanic. I definitely felt the influence of those role-playing games that I brought to COC. So I do wonder if maybe that's colored my experience of it, because it doesn't seem like in the rules that we have so far that there's a lot of, like, here's the skill challenge mechanic, or here's any sort of conceits about that. When I do a deep dive of the Keeper's Handbook, maybe that'll all be present there.
So let's actually dive into our thoughts having played the system. And straight away, the things that I really liked about this system. First of all, the array of skills really caught my attention. When we were actually playing, the idea of having the right skill for the job and knowing what my character was better at and what I should try to avoid doing and being able to use those skills was really interesting. There's some really niche skills that you can have, but then when they come up and, you know, your ability to use computer or spot hidden or swim, I am so glad that I took the swim skill, because now the sewer is being flooded that I was investigating in and I need to get out of here.
It's worth noting that the skills in Call of Cthulhu don't start at 0. Some of them start at 1% if you don't invest points in them. Some of them start at 5% if you don't invest in points in them. But a few others start at 20 or 25%, things like Brawl or Charm. And so even if your character doesn't invest points in those skills, it represents the fact that most people have some capacity to do these things as a baseline, and thus you can still try and then maybe boost them up if your character survives long enough. Even if your character does specialize in a bunch of really, really niche skills, you're still going to have some of those general purpose things. And I guess maybe there's ones where it's like you want to make sure that you got some ability to fight and some ability to find things. But beyond that, so many of the skills are such esoteric, like knowledge things, or things like your ability to drive cars or do mechanical repair, that it feels much more driven by who is the person you're playing instead of trying to have a build.
Another thing that I really liked about this game system is how grounded in reality it is, as opposed to D&D, where I play a sorcerer or a rogue. In this, I played an author, and Jill played a librarian, and you choose your profession, which can be a doctor, a professor, a student, a police detective, really any run-of-the-mill occupation. And those occupations are going to give you certain points or certain skills that you can put points into more than others. And I thought that that was really interesting and really, again, solidifies the fact that you're playing a regular person and you have to bring that character to life and see how they fare in the Cthulhu mythos.
In that respect as well, the system really doesn't care about balance. There isn't much in the way of encounter design rules because there's no rigid sort of fairness around combat. The whole thing is very scenario driven and is structured like a mystery because that's what the goal is. And so I think that there's also a lot more onus on the player's ability to solve mysteries and clues. There's an interesting dichotomy at work here of you still have to be the investigator. You're still solving the mystery. You're still playing a character at the same time. You're still part of this story. But it's less rigid and more fluid. And so you don't need to make sure that you got a tank and a healer and a damage dealer. Everybody can just play the characters they want to play.
They even instill this by calling the players investigators. Right off the bat, before you choose your profession or what you're going to be like as a Call of Cthulhu character, you've already been given the title of investigator, which does imply the main theme of this game, which is that no matter what you're playing, you need to be an investigator. And you as the player are an investigator. Whether it's me playing an author, I, Kelly, am still an investigator playing Call of Cthulhu to investigate a mystery. And I think that that's actually a beautiful way of sort of just telling you right up front what this game is.
I do think that for me that was an interesting takeaway though, because our initial input with both you and Jill was to play very normal characters. You named your character Norman because it was kind of, I'm just a normal person. But I do think that you have to look back at, again, things like Stranger Things and the protagonists of that story, in that all those characters were still willing to get involved in the mystery. And so even, Winona Ryder's character, who was just a mom, she still had the drive to investigate because she had the personal connection to that. And I think that if you are playing a normal everyday character in Call of Cthulhu, you do kind of need to have that element to your character. Yes, maybe someone else is playing Hopper as the police chief who naturally will get involved in the situation. And maybe you might play the precocious teenage journalist that is looking for the scoop. If you're not going into those archetypes where your character is kind of that type of person that is going to get into trouble. Because I think that's one of the interesting things about the modern day setting, too, is that because we're playing in a modern day as modern people, we think naturally about how we would approach the situations.
In our game, there was a moment where we had to crawl into a hole in a graveyard.
Yes.
And I won't lie that if I do have a critique, and it might have been me and my character design, my first Call of Cthulhu character, so not really a critique on the system, just I did know that I had to make some choices that were for the purpose of pushing the plot forward. Mm-hmm. But really, Norman probably would never have crawled in a hole in a graveyard. Yeah. He would have gone home. But what fun is that? I had to have him crawl in the hole in the graveyard because he needed something. And yeah. I think that that's actually an important part. I was saying this to Monty earlier, watching Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosity, something that I pinpointed on many of the main characters in those stories is that they are all regular people, but the first act of each of the stories represents introducing the character, showing that they have a major flaw, and that they are in a bad situation where somebody is going to hurt them or kill them or come after them if they don't get the money to pay them off or X, Y, or Z. So already you're establishing that this character is in a dire situation and has flaws. Then you present a situation that most normal people would not find themselves in or investigate further, but it immediately triggers the element of that character that's like, well, if I don't do this, I'm screwed. What does your character want? And why would they go investigate a terrible mystery to get it?
Yeah.
And you need to have that answer for a Call of Cthulhu so that when there is a hole in a graveyard, your character goes, well, gotta go in because I have no other choice. And I think that's the key. From my brief experience, that's what I took away from building a character.
But that groundedness is still really cool. Like, it's interesting to be in the modern world and to know, oh yeah, there's things like phones and guns and cars and all of these things. And so I like that. And I found it really cool in preparing for this game that I could research a real world location and make notes about a real world location, and that was my game prep. That was my world building. And so there was a shift from Dungeon Master to Keeper in that I was able to not worry about the world building and instead focus on what is the mystery? What is the story here? What happened here? And that's a different way of developing adventures. I'm really interested to try my hand at creating scenarios for COC because it feels like with D&D, like I can just grab, here's a cool castle and a crazy monster, throw them together, done. It feels like I have to do a little bit more work with COC of actually thinking about what happened here, what's the mystery, what's the who, what, where, why, how are the characters going to enter into this? And I feel like that exercise will be a cool takeaway to bring back to D&D. As we come into this part of this discussion, there may be some minor spoilers for Paper Chase, but we're going to try to avoid getting into too many specifics about the details of the mystery.
One last critique that I have, and again, not of the system, more of just my experience with it so far, is coming from a background of being a player of D&D, where everything results in an epic combat encounter with a dragon on top of a castle. I will say that when we played Paper Chase, I was a little taken aback when it ended, and for me, and this might just be the scenario in Paper Chase, which was a beautiful mystery to solve. But when I solved the mystery, I remember thinking, oh, so there wasn't really a situation that needed our attention here. If we had never gotten involved, I feel like things would have played out almost the same.
Yeah. Paper Chase specifically felt strange for me to run because it felt like a very low stakes, conflict-free scenario. And I felt that despite all the brilliance of the other things presented in the starter set, I felt like having this first actual player GM adventure be such a low stakes situation is a bit of a risk. You know, like I do wonder. So I'm interested to run maybe some of the other scenarios that maybe have more of a high stakes to them, or maybe have more of a conflict, or a more dangerous feeling mystery to them, because that alone with Paper Chase, it felt like a perfectly Lovecraftian story.
Absolutely.
It really did. But I just wondered that it was more of a tourist experience for you as players.
I feel like Paper Chase is more Pickman's model than it is Call of Cthulhu.
Yes, it definitely is. That is exactly the comparison that I would draw from it. And so I think that's also why you see the subsystems for Call of Cthulhu, like Pulp Cthulhu, that emphasize more of a pulpy sort of experience. And maybe we should have checked that one out to begin with and looked at Pulp Cthulhu Adventures, because maybe that's a better bridge. But this still gave us something really different from our normal RPG experience. And I liked that. I just think that definitely for myself, like, I think as I dive deeper into COC, I'm going to take more of the Stranger Things, X-Files sort of tack to it and really dive more deeper into some scenarios that have a little bit more kick to them.
That being said, I left Paper Chase hungry for more Call of Cthulhu, which is something that I think is a very rewarding thing to take away from the game. I walked away and the next day was texting you being like, I want to play more Call of Cthulhu. So I think to wrap this all up, we're looking at this from the perspective of two longtime D&D players who are trying out a new system. And I think that if you are looking for a new system to try and you like investigative mystery and horror and cosmic horror and those sort of elements, that Call of Cthulhu gives you what you want. And I think that you will understand 90% of what's going on in this game. And the 10% are really what is actually beautiful about this game and sets it apart from other tabletop role-playing games.
I feel that Call of Cthulhu is the ideal second RPG for D&D players to check out. The reason for this is that it's a difference in both mechanics, setting, tone. Everything about it is just a big difference. Whereas if you were to try something like Dungeon World or Pathfinder or 13th Age, all of which are still medieval fantasy role-playing games just with different mechanics, I don't know if it would highlight the difference of the system so much. And especially because there's a much reduced emphasis on combat and a bigger emphasis on mystery and problem solving. I think that really yields a rewarding experience. And despite our misgivings with the stakes of Paper Chase, it was still a lovely adventure. And from what I understand of just checking out the reviews, many Call of Cthulhu adventures are very well written and highly regarded. And so it definitely is a system that lends itself more to running pre-written scenarios than inventing your own, because I do think it is harder to write a mystery than to just build a dungeon.
So if you've played Call of Cthulhu, please tell us about your favorite things about this system in the comments below. Or if you'd like to see us play more Call of Cthulhu, dive into the mechanics more in future videos, or even do quick videos like this on other systems that we're going to try in the future, please let us know your thoughts in the comments below.
The videos that we create are made possible thanks to the incredible generosity of our Patreon supporters. If you enjoy the work that we do here on YouTube, please consider becoming a patron of our channel by following the links in the description below.
And again, if you want to see us playing Call of Cthulhu, we did a one-shot, which you can check out right up over here.
And of course, if you want just more D&D content, you can find all of that right up over here.
Please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and click the bell so that you get notifications to stay up to date on all of our content.
Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time
in the dungeon.